This is Reading Aloud, and I'm Pat Tully of the Ketchikan Public Library. This evening I'm going to read a few short pieces by Robert Benchley. Benchley was born in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1889, and he wrote pieces for Vanity Fair and The New Yorker. He was also an actor and had bit parts in a number of movies in the 1930s. He also starred in several short comedy films, including How to Sleep, an 11-minute film that was awarded an Academy Award in 1935. So, let's get started. Hail, Vernal Equinox by Robert Benchley. If all that I hear is true, a great deal has been written, first and last, about that season which we slangily call spring, but I don't remember ever having seen it done in really first-class form. That is, in such a way that it left something with you to think over, something that you could put your finger on and say, there's a big vital thought that I could carry away with me to my room. What spring really needs is a regular press agent sort of write-up, something with the punch in it, an article that will make people sit up and say to themselves, by George, there must be something in this spring stuff after all. What sort of popularity did education have until correspondence schools and encyclopedias began to give publicity to it in their advertisements? Where would music be today if it were not for the exhortations of the talking machine and mechanical piano companies telling, through their advertising copywriters, of the spiritual exaltation that comes from a love of music? These things were all right in their way before the press agent took hold of them, but they could never have hoped to reach their present position without him. Of course, all this has just been leading up to the point I want to make, that something more ought to be written about spring. When you consider that everyone, including myself, agrees that nothing more should be written about it, I think that I have done rather well to prove as much as I have so far. And having got this deep into the thing, I can't very well draw back now. Well then, spring is a great season. Nobody will gainsay me that. Without it, we should crash right from winter into summer with no chance to shift to lightweight underwear. I could write a whole piece about that phase of it alone, and if I were pressed for things to say, I myself could enlarge on it now, making up imaginary conversation of people who have been caught in balbriggans by the first sweltering day of summer. But I have so many more things to say about spring that I can't stop to bother with deadwood like that. Such literary filibustering should be left to those who are not so full of their subject as I am. In preparing for this article, I thought it best to look up a little on the technical side of spring, about which so little is known, at least by me. And would you believe it, the Encyclopedia Britannica, which claims in its advertisements not only to make its readers presidents of the boards of directors of any companies they may select, but also shows how easy it would be for Grandpa or little Edna to carry the whole set about from room to room, if, by any possible chance they should ever want to. This same Encyclopedia Britannica makes no reference to spring, except incidentally, along with bed springs and bubbling springs. This slight of one of our most popular seasons is probably due to the fact that spring is not an exclusively a British product and was not invented by a Briton. Had spring been fortunate enough to have had the second Earl of Shropshire as one of its founders, the Britannica could probably have seen its way clear to give it a 5-page article signed by the curator of the Jade Department in the British Museum and illustrated with color plates showing the effect of spring on the vertical and transverse sections of the stamen of the South African Euphorbiaceae. I was what you might, but probably wouldn't, call stunned at not finding anything about the season of love in the encyclopedia, for without that assistance, what sort of a scientific article could I do on the subject? I am not good at improvising as I go along, especially in astronomical matters. But we Americans are not so easily thwarted. Quick as a wink, I looked up equinox. There is a renewed agitation of late to abolish Latin from our curricula. Had I not known my Latin, I could never have figured out what equinox meant, and this article would never have been written. Take that, Mr. Flexner. While finding equinox, however, I came across the word equilibrium, which is the word before you come to equinox, and I became quite absorbed in what it had to say on the matter. There were a great many things started there that I had never dreamed of before, even in my wildest vagaries on the subject of equilibrium. For instance, did you know that if you cover the head of a bird, as in hooding a falcon, do you remember the good old days when you used to run away from school to hood falcons? The bird is deprived of the power of voluntary movement. Just think of that. Deprived of the power of voluntary movement simply because its head is covered. And as if this were not enough, it says that the same thing holds true of a fish. If you should ever, on account of a personal grudge, want to get the better of a fish, just sneak up to him on some pretext or other and suddenly cover its eyes with a cloth. And there you have it, helpless and unable to move. You may then insult it, and it can do nothing but tremble with rage. It is little practical things like this that you pick up in reading a good reference book, thing that you would never get in 10 years at college. For instance, take the word equites, which follows equinox in the encyclopedia. What do you know about equites, Mr. Businessman? Of course, you remember in a vague way that they were Roman horsemen or something, but in the broader sense of the word, could you have told that the term equites came in the time of Gaius Gracchus to mean anyone who had 400,000 sesterces? Nope, I thought not. And yet that is a point which is apt to come up any day at the office. A customer from St. Paul might come in and, of course, you would take him out to lunch, hoping to land a big order. Where would you be if his hobby should happen to be equites? And if he should come out in the middle of the conversation with, by the way, do you remember how many sesterces it was necessary to have during the administration of Gaius Gracchus in order to belong to the equites? If you could snap right back at him with 400,000, I believe the order would be assured. And if, in addition, you could volunteer the information that an excellent account of the family life of the equites could be found in Mommsen's Römische Staatsrecht, Volume 3, your customer would probably not only sign up for a 10-year contract, but would insist on paying for the lunch. If you could snap right back at him with 400,000, I believe, the order would be assured. But, of course, this has practically nothing to do with spring, or as the boys call it, the vernal equinox. The vernal equinox is a serious matter. In fact, I think I may say without violating any confidence that it is the initial point from which the right ascensions and the longitudes of the heavenly bodies are measured. This statement will probably bring down a storm of ridicule on my head, but look how Fulton was ridiculed. In fact, I might go even further and say the way to seek out spring is not to trail along with the poets and essayists into the woods and fields and stand about in the mud until a half-clothed bird comes out and peeps. If you really want to be in on the official advent of spring, you may sit in a nice warm observatory and, entirely free from head colds, proceed with the following simple course. Take first the conception of a fictitious point which we shall call, for fun, the mean equinox. This mean equinox moves at a nearly uniform rate, slowly varying from century to century. Now here comes the trick of the thing. The mean equinox is merely a decoy, and once you have determined it, you shift suddenly to the true equinox, which you can tell, according to Professor A. M. Clerk's treatise on the subject, because it moves around the mean equinox in a period equal to that of the moon's nodes. Now all you have to do is find out what the moon's nodes are. Isn't it funny that you can be as familiar with an object as you are with the moon and see it almost every night, and yet never know that it has even one node? Not to mention nodes. And then find out how fast they move. This done, and you have discovered the vernal equinox, or spring, and without spilling a dactyl. On the subject of spring's arrival, intuition may be led astray. how much simpler this is than the old romantic way of determining when spring comes. A poet had to depend on his intuition for information, and on the subject of spring's arrival, intuition may be led astray by any number of things. You may be sitting over one of those radiators which are concealed under window seats, for instance, and before you are aware of it, feel what you take to be the first flush of spring creeping over you. It would be obviously premature to go out and write a poem on youth and love and young onions on the strength of that. I once heard of a young man who in November discovered that he had an intellectual attachment for a certain young woman and felt that married life with her would be without doubt a success. But he could never work himself up to sufficient emotional enthusiasm to present the proposition to her in phrases that he knew she had been accustomed to receive from other suitors. He knew that she wouldn't respond to a proposal of marriage couched in terms of a real estate transaction. Yet such were the only ones that he felt himself capable of at the moment under the prevailing weather conditions. So knowing something of biology, he packed his little bag and rented an alcove in a nearby greenhouse, where he basked in the intensified sun warmth and odor of young tube roses, until, with a cry, he smashed the glass which separated him from his heart's desire and tore around the corner to her house, dashing in the back door and flinging himself at her feet as she was whipping some cream, and there poured forth such a torrent of ardent sentiments that there was really nothing that the poor girl could do but marry him that afternoon. In fact, if you want to speak astronomically, as some people do, you may define spring even more definitely. Since we are all here together, and good friends, let us take the center of the earth as origin, and once we have done this, the most natural fundamental axis is, obviously, the Earth's rotation. The fundamental plane perpendicular to it is the plane of the equator. That goes without saying. Now, here we go. Coordinates referred to in this system are turned equatorial, and I think that you will agree with me that nothing could be fairer than that. Very well then. Since this is so, we may define spring by the following geometric representation in which the angle SZOP made by the radius vector with the fundamental plane shows a spring-like tendency. This drawing we may truthfully entitle Spring, and while it hasn't perhaps the color found in Botticelli's painting of the same name, yet it just as truthfully represents spring in these parts as do the unstable sort of ladies in the more famous picture. I only wish that I had more space in which to tell what my heart is full of in connection with this subject. I really have only just begun. The end. Next, gardening notes. During the past month, almost every paper, with the exception of the agricultural journals, has installed an agricultural department, containing short articles by Lord Northcliffe or someone else in the office who had an unoccupied typewriter, telling the American citizen how to start and hold the interest of a small garden. The seed catalog has become the catechism of the patriot, and if you don't like to read the brusque, prosy directions on planting as given there, you may find the same thing done in verse in your favorite poetry magazine, or a special department in the plumbing age under the heading, The Plumber's Garden, How and When to Plant. But all of these editorial suggestions appear to be conducted by professionals for the benefit of the layman, which seems to me to be a rather one-sided way of going about the thing. Obviously, the suggestion should come from a layman himself in the nature of warnings to others. I am qualified to put forth such an article because of the 2-week service in my own backyard, doing my bit for Peter Henderson and planting all sorts of things in the ground without the slightest expectation of ever seeing anything of any of them again. If by any chance a sprout should show itself, unmistakably the result of one of my plantings, I would be willing to be quoted as saying, "Nature is wonderful." In fact, I would take it as a personal favor and would feel that anything I might do in the future for nature would be little enough in return for the special work she went to all the trouble of doing for me. But all of this is on the condition that something of mine grows into manhood. Otherwise, nature can go her way and I go mine, just as we have gone up to now. However, although I am an amateur, I shall have to adopt in my writing the tone of a professional, or I shall never get anyone to believe what I say. If, therefore, from now on I sound a bit cold and unfriendly, you will realize that a professional agricultural writer has to have some dignity about his stuff, and that beneath my rough exterior I am a pleasant enough sort of person to meet socially. Preparing the ground for the garden. This is one of the most important things that the young gardener is called upon to do. In fact, a great many young gardeners never do anything further. Some inherited weakness, something they never realized they had before, may crop out during this process. Weak back, tendency of shoulder blades to ossification, misplacement of several important vertebrae, are all apt to be discovered for the first time during the course of one day's digging. If, on the morning following the first attempt to prepare the ground for planting, you are able to walk in a semi-erect position as far as the bathtub, and, without outside assistance, lift 1 foot into the water, you may flatter yourself that you are, joint for joint, in as perfect condition as the man in the rubber heel advertisements. Authorities differ as to the best way of digging. All agree that it is impossible to avoid walking about during the following week as if you were impersonating an old waiter with the lumbago. But there are 2 schools, each with its own theory, as to the less painful method. One advocates bending over, without once raising up, until the whole row is dug. The others, of whom I must confess that I am one, feel that it is better to draw the body to a more or less erect position after each shovelful. In support of this contention, Greets, the well-known authority on the muscles of the back, says the constant tightening and relaxing of the latissimus dorsi, effected in the raising of the body as the earth is tossed aside, has a tendency to relieve the strain by distributing it equally among the serratus posticus inferior in the corner of 34th Street. He then goes on to say practically what I have said above. The necessity for work in such a strenuous nature in the mere preliminaries of the process of planting a garden is due to the fact that the average backyard has, up till the present time, been behaving less like a garden than anything else in the world. You might think that a backyard, possessed of an ordinary amount of decency and civic pride would, at some time during its career, have said to itself, "Now look here, I may some day be called upon to be a garden, and the least I can do is get myself into some sort of shape, so that, when the time comes, I will be fairly ready to receive a seed or 2. But no, year in and year out they have been drifting along in a fool's paradise, accumulating stones and queer, indistinguishable cans and things, until they were prepared to become anything, quarries, iron mines, notion counters, anything but gardens. I have saved in a box all the things I have dug from my backyard, and when I have them assembled, all I will need will be a good engine to make them into a fairly decent runabout. Nothing elaborate, mind you, but good enough to run the family out in on Sunday afternoons. And then there are lots of other things that wouldn't even fit into the runabout. Queer-looking objects they are, things that perhaps in their heyday were rather stunning, but which have now assumed the air of indifference, as if to say, "Oh, call me anything, old fellow. Ice pick, mainspring, cigar lighter, anything. I don't care. I tell you, it's enough to make a man stop and think." But there, I mustn't get sentimental. In preparing the soil for planting, you will need several tools. Dynamite would be a beautiful thing to use, but it would have a tendency to get the dirt into the front hall and track up the stairs. This not being practicable, there is no other way but for you to get at it with a fork, well, don't be silly, a spade and a rake. If you have an empty and detached furnace boiler, you might bring that along to fill up the stones that you will dig up. If it is a small garden, you ought not to have to empty the boiler more than 3 or 4 times. Any neighbor who is building a stone house will be glad to contract with you for the stones, and those that are left over after he has got his house built can be sold to another neighbor who is building another stone house. Your market is limited only by the number of neighbors who are building stone houses. On the first day, when you find yourself confronted by a stretch of untouched ground which is to be turned over, technical phrase meaning to turn over, you may be somewhat at a loss to know where to begin. Such indecision is only natural and should cause no worry on the part of the young gardener. It is something we all have to go through with. You may feel that it would be futile and unsystematic to go about digging up a forkful here and a shovelful there, tossing the earth at random, in the hope that in due time you will get the place dug up. And so it would. The thing to do is to decide just where you want your garden and what its dimensions are to be. This will have necessitated a previous drawing up of a chart, showing just what it is to be planted and where. As this chart will be the cause of considerable hard feeling in the family circle, usually precipitating a fist fight over the number of rows of onions to be set out, I will not touch on that in this article. There are some things too intimate for even a professional agriculturalist to write of. I will say, however, that those in the family who are standing out for onions might much better save their time and feelings by pretending to give in, and then, later in the day, sneaking out and slipping the sprouts in by themselves in some spot where they know where to find them again. Having decided on the general plan and dimensions of the plot, gather the family about as if for a cornerstone dedication, and then make a rather impressive ceremony of driving in the first stake by getting your little boy to sing the first 12 words of some patriotic air. If he doesn't know the first 12, any 12 will do. The idea is to keep the music going during the driving of the stake. Make a rather impressive ceremony of driving that first stake. The stake is to be driven at an imaginary corner of what is to be your garden, and a string stretched to another stake at another imaginary corner, and there you will have the line along which to dig. This will be a big comfort. You will feel that at last you have something tangible. Now all that remains is to turn the ground over, harrow it, smooth it up nice and neat, plant your seeds, cultivate them, thin out your plants, and pick the crops. It may seem that I have spent most of my time and advice on preparing the ground for planting. Such may well be the case, as that was as far as I got. I then found a man who likes to do those things and whose doctor has told him that he ought to be out of doors all the time. He is an Italian and charges really very little when you consider what he accomplishes. Any further advice on starting and keeping a garden, I shall have to get him to write for you. The end. Thank you so much for joining me, and have a good week.